This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Israel slams the decision by the International Criminal Court to try Israel for war crimes. Plus, an exclusive report on the Daughters of Kobani, Kurdish women who stood up to ISIS. And follow the lights. Jerusalem puts on a light show for Israel. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. The International Criminal Court prosecutor has launched a probe against Israel and Hamas for alleged war crimes. The decision drew sharp criticism from Israel and praise from Palestinians. Several years ago, Palestinians asked the ICC to investigate Israel for war crimes. Last month, judges decided they had jurisdiction over the area known as the West Bank and Gaza. Fatou Bensouda, the prosecutor driving this investigation, focuses on the 2014 Gaza war. While she calls out Hamas for crimes such as attacking Israeli civilians and using its own people as human shields, Bensouda also charges Israel responded too strongly, leaving dead and wounded Palestinians in its wake. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu slammed the prosecutor's decision.
I think this is an outrageous decision that goes against the one democracy in the Middle East, Israel, whose soldiers honorably and scrupulously do everything to avoid civilian casualties as they're fighting the worst terrorists on earth. This is pure anti-Semitism.
The prosecutor also expands her charges to the so-called occupied territories, which refers to Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria and eastern Jerusalem.
I'm in Jerusalem, not very far from the old city of Jerusalem, which has been our capital since the time of King David for 3,000 years. They say that if we build a house in Jerusalem, that's a war crime. The ICC, the International Court, was built to prevent the kind of horrors that were committed on the Jewish people by the Nazis, and now they're turning their guns on the one and only state of the Jewish people.
Hamas welcomed the decision as a step forward to implement justice.
Hamas stresses clearly and decisively that the resistance by our Palestinian people and all the resistance by the national factions in Palestine are a legitimate resistance, and its natural role is to resist the occupation and restore the land and the holy places according to all international laws.
Defense Minister Benny Gantz, who could also be a target of the investigations, says the ICC probe rewards terrorism and terror organizations.
Israel is the only situation where the court is investigating a non-member state at the behest of a member, the Palestinian Authority, which is not a state.
International law expert Eugene Kontorovich says regardless of any decision against Israelis, the court has no enforcement authority. He adds, however, the impact would be on the world stage.
What this really is about is the Palestinians seeking to establish the fact of their statehood and their maximalist borders outside of negotiations. So the Palestinians, they don't need anything else to happen for them to have already won.
Kontorovich says, bottom line, Israel should not even address the charges since the court has no jurisdiction over it.
But Israel should definitely ignore it. It should treat it as a hostile political entity.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu blamed Iran for an attack on an Israeli-owned ship in the Persian Gulf. The crisis is the latest confrontation between Israel and Iran in the region. Prime Minister Netanyahu told Israel's public radio broadcast this was indeed an operation by Iran. That is clear. Netanyahu would not say if Israel would retaliate, but overnight the IDF launched an attack inside Syria against Iranian targets. Iran denied it had anything to do with the attack, but on Sunday, Israel Defense Forces Chief of Staff Aviv Kohavi warned the attack as a reminder Iran is one of the biggest threats in the region.
Iran is not only a nuclear threat, but it spreads terrorism and carries out terrorism and actions against civilian targets. This is the place to reiterate that the IDF is acting and will act in the face of the threats that endanger it from both near and far.
The Israeli-owned ship, the Helios Ray, is now in dock in the port of Dubai for repairs. The crew was not harmed, but the vessel sustained damage to its hull. Some suspect the attack came from mines laid by Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. The incident raised concerns about security for shipping in the Middle East and comes while Israel and Iran are facing off over Iran's nuclear program. Iran is now enriching uranium one step below weapons grade. And on Sunday, Iran rejected informal talks with the U.S. and European Union unless President Biden drops all economic sanctions first. In yet another incident, at least 10 rockets struck an Iraqi military base in western Iraq that hosts U.S.-led coalition troops. Despite the attack and the COVID-19 pandemic, Pope Francis paid his visit to Iraq. His visit includes Baghdad, Erbil, and Karakosh in the Nineveh Plain, where he is saying Mass at a church once desecrated by ISIS. CBN News visited this church after ISIS burned pews, destroyed crosses, and other Christian symbols. The church has been restored, and many volunteers clean the church in anticipation of the Pope's visit. Many see it as a sign of hope.
We volunteered to clean Al-Tahira Church. We are cleaning it as part of the preparations for the Pope's visit to our town. Indeed, the Pope's visit is a happy message for everyone, especially for those in Hamdaniya, because this is considered a historical event, and we are very happy because the Pope is coming.
We are passing a message to the Pope and the world that we are here. We, the Christians, are remaining on our land. Our roots are here. It is impossible to leave the homeland that embraced us. It is true that it also hurt us, but the wounds are the starting point for healing, as the wounds of Jesus were the starting point to his path to resurrection.
In contrast to its conflict with Iran, and thanks to the Abraham Accords agreement, Israel has welcomed its first ever ambassador from the United Arab Emirates. As Julie Stahl reports, his arrival coincides with signs of a potential security alliance forming between Israel and Gulf states.
Israel rolled out the red carpet, complete with the Emirati flag and national anthem, to welcome the new ambassador in Jerusalem. Mohammed Al-Khaja presented his credentials to President Reuven Rivlin, who thanked God in Hebrew and Arabic.
You should know that not only am I moved, the entire Israeli people are excited and welcome you with joy.
I hope to go forward in building a warm peace in which all the people of the region will enjoy.
Al-Khaja also met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
We are making history, and making history requires wisdom, courage, and confidence.
Right.
And
I would say competence too.
Competence, absolutely.
Competence is also important, but we have all that in abundance, so you're going to have your hands full.
Meanwhile, according to the Jerusalem Post, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain have informally discussed a possible security alliance to face common enemies. While all four countries are U.S. allies, Israel has no formal ties with the Saudi kingdom.
These are countries that have shared concerns, shared regional worldview. They're on a trajectory towards, emerging alliance system and working closely together and sharing all sorts of information. But this takes a lot of time.
This potential comes as regional tension is growing over Iran's nuclear pursuit. Middle East expert Seth Frantzman says other concerns include Iranian-supported militias and a Turkish regime that backs the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas.
Turkey and Iran are kind of eating up pieces of the region, and their own borders are very totalitarian, kind of stable countries. Wherever they send militias, they destabilize. They send poverty. They don't build universities. They send weapons.
The four regional players are also concerned over the Biden administration's plan to rejoin the 2015 Iranian nuclear deal.
The key part of the nuclear deal issue is that the Biden administration hopefully will listen to Israel and the Gulf states and make sure that any subsequent deal will really keep Iran from ever possessing enrichment opportunities that would lead to a weapon, not for 5 or 10 years, but basically forever.
Frantzman says Biden needs to make sure that any agreement will stop Iran in every arena.
Iran's really smart. It plays the region like a piano. So if you say to Iran, well, okay, you can't play the keys of the piano over here. Okay, fine, I'll just play them over here. So you have to think that the Biden administration needs to understand that it has to stop the whole concerto.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
As the U.S. prepares to re-enter negotiations with Iran over its nuclear program, some say the Islamic Republic's persecuted prisoners must be part of the deal. Jennifer Wishon explains.
Yusuf Nadakani is the leader of the evangelical church in Iran. He was pastoring a thriving flock of 400 members when he was violently arrested in 2018. It was his most recent in a long record of run-ins with Islamic law enforcement that included being sentenced to death, all for practicing his Christian faith. He's currently incarcerated at the nation's notorious Evin prison, and he's not alone. Iran routinely mistreats, imprisons, and tortures non-Muslims.
The Iranian government must be held accountable for their abhorrent treatment of Pastor Yusuf.
Now, as the Biden administration works to reestablish talks with Iran over its nuclear program, religious freedom advocates say the U.S. must use every ounce of leverage to help the persecuted.
The continued unjustified detainment of prisoners like Pastor Yusuf increasingly jeopardizes Iran's already unstable position.
Commissioner Johnny Moore quoted Wang Shenyu, an American who was held hostage for 3 years in the same prison that houses Pastor Yusuf.
Iran has demonstrated that it changes its behavior only in response to strength in the form of American-led international pressure. If the present administration returns to the JCPOA without extracting concessions from Iran beyond the nuclear threat, it will relinquish all U.S. leverage over the regime. Diplomacy can't succeed without leverage.
Appeals to the Biden administration came during a hearing to highlight the Prisoners of Conscience program sponsored by the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Family members advocated for their loved ones who've been jailed for their faith or belief. Susanna Coe spoke about her husband Raymond, who served as pastor of the Evangelical Church of Malaysia before disappearing during this well-orchestrated abduction.
He loves to tell Bible stories to whoever that is willing to listen.
Since the commission began its Prisoners of Conscience program, 14 have been released. Jennifer Wishon, CBN News.
Up next, the Daughters of Kobani, the Kurdish women who stood up to ISIS and won. They're known as the women who helped save their city from ISIS. In 2014, a female Kurdish militia in the town of Kobani handed the Islamic State its first real defeat, helping drive the terrorists out of northern Syria. As Wendy Griffith reports, their story is now the subject of a new book, The Daughters of Kobani.
In 2014, the Islamic State had swept across much of Syria, overtaking cities and spreading terror as civil war raged all around it.
As ISIS approached a town called Kobani, a group of Kurdish female fighters armed with AK-47s and a lot of courage were determined not to let ISIS take their town, their homes, or their families.
Although they had braided hair and painted fingernails, when it came to fighting ISIS, they were as fierce as any male army.
They weren't just fighting ISIS, but they were leading in battle, leading men and women in the fight against the extremists of the Islamic State.
In her book, The Daughters of Kobani, author Gail Samak Lamon introduces us to these women, including Azima, a sniper determined to stop ISIS at all costs.
Even when so many people had lost faith that Kobani would not fall, she would absolutely tell everybody, including her fighters and including her sister, who sometimes called while she was in the middle of battle, literally taking fire from the Islamic State. She would say, "We will not lose Kobani. We will fight until the end and we'll win."
Was ISIS afraid of these female fighters?
Yes, you asked me about Azima. Azima had a great story about how, at the beginning, she would hear on the walkie-talkies the men from ISIS say, try to pick off the women, try to kill the women first. And then at the end, when they saw what good snipers they were, they would be on the radio saying, "Hey, don't get too close to those women snipers. They're very good." And they took that as a huge compliment. And there was also the fact that their men of the Islamic State felt they couldn't go to paradise if they were killed by a woman. And they would get on the radio and really say terrible things to these women, who then used it as motivation to power them in their fight against ISIS.
Lamont's research into the Women's Protection Forces took her to the front lines, where she also spent time with Christian female fighters.
And, one young woman from a Christian family told me that her mother at first did not approve of her joining the all-women's force. And then, ISIS by then had kidnapped Christians in the Hawar Valley. And when her parents would go to church, people would come up to them and say, "We're so proud of what your daughter is doing." And I really hope that the Daughters of Kobani does justice to the courage, the bravery, the power of these young women.
The battle for Kobani was considered a turning point in the war against the Islamic State. How big a role did this female militia play in freeing Kobani from the grip of ISIS?
Women were front and center in the fight to stop the Islamic State. And in Kobani, this was their first battlefield defeat. And women played a central role in handing it to them.
Lamont says their battle skills earned the respect of U.S. Special Forces fighting alongside them.
And there's a story of one man who said, when I saw how many young women, ponytails and AK-47s going off to fight ISIS, I thought, wow, this is definitely a first for me. They are real and true warriors.
For many of these women, this was not just about defeating ISIS, although that was their major focus, but giving women more equality in the Middle East. Do you think they achieved that goal?
There is no question that the next generation of girls born will see women protecting them in that part of Syria and in that part of the region. And there's a story that's in the book when they finally clear the town of Manbij of the Islamic State. A woman comes out and sort of puts her hands on the faces of the young women and said, we didn't even know you were real. Heard about you, but we didn't know you were real. And I think that's the power of seeing what women can be.
Wendy Griffith, CBN News.
If you would like to know more about the Daughters of Kobani, you can go to cbnnews.com. Coming up, Written in Stone, CBN's new film on the House of David. Thanks. CBN's new documentary, Written in Stone, House of David, examines how archaeologists are finding more and more evidence of King David's biblical kingdom. Here's another preview of CBN's new film, Written in Stone.
One of David's greatest victories took place here, in the valley of Elah. This is where the young shepherd killed the giant Goliath. High above the valley is a fortress that's thousands of years old. To the local Bedouin, this place is still known as Khirbet Daoud, or David's Ruin. It's the only Iron Age city in Israel that's perfectly preserved and almost frozen in time.
For us as archaeologists, this is one of the richest sites in Israel. This is like a biblical Pompeii.
The site's Hebrew name is Khirbet Qeiyafa, the fortress of Elah. Archaeologist Joseph Garfinkel first uncovered the city in 2007. He recovered some burnt olive pits from the site and sent them to Oxford University for carbon dating.
And this was the revolution, because the results were that the city is 3,000 years old. It was a fortified city in Judah from the time of King David. Nothing like this was found before. And it's proved that in the early 10th century, in the time of King David, you have a fortified city, you have administration, you have writing, we have a palace there, so you have a central authority. So all the claims of the law chronology, which says that these things developed in Judah only 300 years later, have been proven to be wrong.
In David's day, the Elah Valley was a neutral zone between the Israelites and the Philistines. In Qeiyafa, which was right on the front lines, excavators discovered a large cache of weapons.
We are sharing some light on the story of David and Goliath.
If you would like to get your own copy of the entire film, log on to cbn.com. Up next, Jerusalem puts on a light show all over the city when we come back. After a year of lockdowns and restrictions, the city of Jerusalem invited Israelis to a festival, a drive-through light show for the people of the city. Here's a look at how Jerusalem lit up the town.
beautiful. New Jerusalem together with the old Jerusalem. That's what is Jerusalem today.
Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And you can also access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And don't forget to sign up for our email blasts so you can continue to receive all of our exciting CBN content. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.